If your idea of God makes you live in fear, Spinoza would ask a terrifying question. Are you worshiping truth or obeying an image built by fear? You may not call it fear, you may call it reverence, you may call it humility. But deep inside, there is something that tightens when you think about God. A feeling that you are never quite good enough. A quiet dread that your mistakes have been recorded, counted, and will one day be presented as a sentence. That feeling is not theology. It is suffering. And millions of sincere, serious, searching people carry it every single day. Some of you have lain awake at night wondering whether God has abandoned you. You have prayed and felt silence. You have tried to be good and still felt the weight of punishment approaching. You have confessed, repented, and begun again, only to feel the same guilt return like a tide that never fully goes out. The fear of divine judgment is one of the most ancient pains a human being can carry. And the question this video is not afraid to ask is this: where did that fear actually come from? Spinoza will not tell you that God does not exist. He will not mock your prayers or dismiss the depth of your spiritual life. What he will do is something more unsettling and more liberating. He will ask you to look clearly at the mental mechanism behind your fear. Because if fear is the foundation of your relationship with the divine, then you are not worshiping God. You are worshiping the image of punishment. And those are not the same thing. Many people believe that the intensity of their fear is proof of its truth. If the fear of God feels overwhelming, it must mean that God is truly terrifying. If the guilt feels crushing, it must mean the sin was real. But Spinoza understood something that this logic completely ignores. Intensity is not evidence. A belief can feel absolute, sacred, and eternal simply because it was repeated with enough authority, enough emotion, and enough consequence attached to it. Fear does not validate its own cause. It only reports its own presence. Think of a child raised in an environment where certain words, images, and stories were delivered alongside punishment, shame, and the withdrawal of love. That child does not feel fear because they reasoned their way to it. They feel fear because fear was the air they breathed. And when that child grows into an adult, the fear does not disappear. It migrates. It finds new theological language, new rituals, new ways of presenting itself as wisdom. What felt like inherited truth may have been inherited dread wearing the mask of holiness. The hidden enemy is not God. The hidden enemy is superstition, and superstition is not simply believing in the invisible. Superstition, as Spinoza understood it, is allowing fear and imagination to replace reason and understanding as the guides of your inner life. It is building a picture of reality around what you were told to fear rather than around what you have genuinely come to understand. And the most dangerous feature of superstition is that it feels exactly like truth. It wraps itself in sacred language, in ancient authority, in the voices of people you once loved and trusted. Inherited guilt is one of the most powerful chains the mind can wear. It arrives before the capacity for critical thought. It attaches itself to the deepest parts of identity, your sense of worth, your sense of safety, your sense of whether you deserve to be loved. And because it arrives so early and so completely, most people never examine it. They simply live inside it. They take the guilt as information about their spiritual state, when in truth, it is information about the environment that shaped them. When fear becomes a permanent feature of someone's relationship with the divine, it does not stay quiet. It moves through every part of life. It colors relationships, decisions, moments of joy. A person in religious fear cannot fully receive pleasure without bracing for punishment, cannot succeed without waiting for the correction, cannot rest inside love because love itself becomes suspicious. That is not a relationship with God. That is mental bondage dressed in the language of devotion. This is not only an ancient problem. Look at what surrounds you today. Online preachers who build entire platforms on moral panic, warning their audiences that disaster is always approaching and that only obedience can protect them. Family dinner tables where guilt is delivered alongside food and love is made conditional on belief. Social media feeds full of spiritual content that uses the language of God to produce anxiety, comparison, and shame. The mechanism is the same, only the delivery has changed. Modern fear-based spirituality often disguises itself as depth. It calls itself conviction. It calls itself seriousness. It claims that anyone who questions the fear is simply running from accountability. But Spinoza would make a sharp distinction here. Accountability requires understanding. Fear requires only a threat. And a mind that cannot distinguish between the two is not free. It is simply controlled by whichever voice manages to sound the most authoritative. If this is beginning to name something you have felt but never quite put into words, press the like button right now. Not for this channel, but for every person who has lived under the weight of religious fear and never had a single clear voice help them understand what was actually happening inside them. Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated from his own community at the age of 23. The exact reasons were never recorded, but what we know from his life and work is this: he refused to let fear govern his thinking. He refused to accept inherited images of a punishing, jealous God as the final word on the nature of reality. He did not do this out of arrogance. He did it because he believed that genuine understanding of God or nature was the highest form of freedom a human being could reach. And he paid a serious price for that belief. Spinoza was not interested in destroying faith. He was interested in freeing it from superstition. He saw how religious institutions of his time used fear, guilt, and punishment imagery to control populations. He saw how ordinary people built their inner lives around the dread of divine judgment rather than the love of understanding. And he wrote, with mathematical precision and emotional courage, a different vision. One in which God is not a tyrant watching your failures, but the infinite totality of reality itself. One in which understanding that reality rather than fearing it is the only genuine form of worship. Spinoza's philosophy begins with a simple but radical commitment. Everything that exists has a cause. Every thought, every emotion, every belief, every fear. Nothing rises up from nothing, and this principle applied to religious fear produces a realization that changes everything. Your fear of God did not come from God, It came from causes, specific, traceable human causes. Those causes may include the particular doctrine you were taught as a child, in language that left no room for question. They may include a preacher who delivered punishment imagery with enough emotional intensity to make it feel like prophecy. They may include a moment of personal crisis in which you were told that suffering was divine correction. They may include the trauma of loving someone who used God's name to justify control. These are not small things. They are real causes that produced a real effect. And that effect lives in you as fear. When you understand the causes of an emotion, you begin to change your relationship with that emotion. This is not the same as dismissing it. Spinoza did not ask people to pretend their fears were nothing. He asked people to understand them. Because a fear you do not understand owns you. A fear you understand you can examine. You can ask whether the cause was adequate, whether the teaching was true, whether the image was accurate, and in that examination the grip of the fear begins to loosen. Not because the question is comfortable, but because understanding is always more powerful than obedience to dread. Spinoza made a distinction that cuts directly through the center of religious fear. He distinguished between passive emotions and active understanding. A passive emotion is one that happens to you. It arrives from the outside, from a teaching, a threat, a memory, an image, and it moves through you without your consent and without your comprehension. Fear of divine punishment is almost always a passive emotion. It was placed inside you before you had the tools to examine it, and it has been reinforced so many times that it now feels like your own conclusion. Active understanding is different. It is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling that has been brought into the light of reason. When you begin to actively examine why you fear, what you were taught, by whom, under what circumstances, and with what emotional consequences, you are no longer simply obeying an inherited image. You are thinking, and for Spinoza, that thinking is not a betrayal of the divine. It is the highest expression of the mind's nature. This does not mean religious feeling must be cold or analytical. The goal is not to replace depth with distance. It is to replace blind fear with clear sight. A person who understands why they were taught to fear and who has examined those teachings honestly can still choose reverence, awe, devotion, and love. But those feelings will now come from understanding rather than from the threat of punishment. And that difference is not small. That difference is the distance between mental slavery and inner freedom. You are not spiritually defective. If you have spent years living in fear of God, that does not mean you are evil, weak, or beyond understanding. It means you were exposed to certain ideas delivered with enough force and enough repetition that they became the architecture of your inner world. You did not choose to build that architecture. You did not sit down one day and decide that guilt would be your permanent companion. The fear was given to you, and you received it as all of us receive the deepest beliefs of childhood before you had the power to refuse. Spinoza would be precise here. He would not say you are wrong for having been shaped by your history. He would say that every human being is the effect of causes that preceded them. The person who grew up with threatening sermons, with conditional love, with the constant surveillance of divine judgment, could not have emerged from that environment without carrying its marks. The question is not whether you were shaped. Every human being was. The question is whether you can now begin to understand how you were shaped and what that understanding makes possible. This is the reframe that changes everything. Religious fear is not proof that God is terrifying. It is proof that the ideas delivered to you about God contained enough threat to produce that response. The fear is real. The suffering is real. But the conclusion the fear seems to point to, that you are condemned, abandoned, or permanently guilty, is not a revelation. It is an effect. And effects, once understood, no longer have to be accepted as destiny. Picture a dark altar in the center of your mind, not built from stone, but from every sermon that ended with a threat, every prayer that was followed by silence, every moment you were told that your suffering was punishment for something you may not even fully remember. That altar does not sit quietly. It judges. It watches. It delivers verdicts in the voice of whoever first taught you that God was watching your failures more closely than your worth. This is the emotional mechanism Spinoza exposes. Guilt is not always wisdom. Sometimes guilt is a chain so old and so familiar that the mind has stopped noticing it is there. The person who cannot receive a good day without waiting for the correction, who cannot love without bracing for abandonment, who cannot rest inside joy because joy feels like pride and pride feels like sin. That person is not living in relationship with the divine. They are living in a prison whose walls were built from misunderstood authority and inherited shame. Punishment imagery works by replacing the complexity of reality with a single emotional logic. Obey or suffer. And when that logic is applied to God, it does something particularly devastating. It takes the infinite, the ground of all existence, and reduces it to a threat. It takes the question of meaning, which is among the most serious questions a human being can ask, and replaces it with terror. And then it calls that terror faith. But fear is not the same as faith, and the difference between them is not a small theological detail. It is the difference between a life lived in understanding and a life lived in a cage. The chain of religious fear is unusual in this way. It becomes invisible the longer it has been worn. The person who has always been afraid of divine judgment does not experience their fear as an external imposition. They experience it as their own conscience, their own moral instinct, their own inner voice. And this is precisely what makes it so difficult to examine. You are not looking at a belief someone else holds. You are looking at something you have taken to be the sound of your own soul. Here is the truth that is not easy to hear. Some people fear God because they were taught to fear authority before they were ever introduced to the idea of God. The figure of an all-seeing, all-judging divine power was not their first encounter with the structure of power and fear. That structure came first in the form of parents, teachers, communities, and institutions where love was conditional. Correction was swift and questioning was dangerous. God arrived later, but into a mind that had already learned how authority works. When authority equals fear, God becomes the ultimate authority and therefore the ultimate fear. This is not cynicism, it is cause and effect. And understanding this does not destroy faith. It asks faith to grow beyond the emotional vocabulary of a frightened child. It asks the adult mind to ask a genuinely serious question. What is the nature of the reality I call God? And is my relationship with that reality built on understanding or on dread? If you are beginning to see the difference between God and the fear of God, between reverence and dread, between faith and a chain you have been taught to call holiness, comment the word freedom below this video, not as a rebellion against belief, as a signal that your mind is beginning to ask the question Spinoza spent his life trying to answer. The first step Spinoza's philosophy demands is this: name the cause. Not the name of God, not the name of your fear, but the specific, traceable origin of the dread you carry. Ask yourself where your image of God as judge, as punisher, as the one who watches for failure first arrived. Was it a specific person? A specific teaching? A moment in which punishment and divine authority were presented as the same thing? A community where belonging required fear? This is not an exercise in blame. Spinoza was not interested in producing resentment. He was interested in producing clarity, because as long as the cause of your fear remains invisible, the fear continues to feel like truth about God rather than information about your history. The moment you can say, I was taught this in this way by this kind of authority, the fear stops being the voice of the divine. It becomes an effect with a traceable origin, and that shift is enormous. This kind of naming requires courage. It is not comfortable to look at the teachings of people you once trusted or still love and ask whether those teachings served your freedom or your bondage. But Spinoza never said the path to understanding was comfortable. He said it was necessary, and the necessity is this: a mind that does not examine its own causes is always at the mercy of them. The examination is not the betrayal of your spiritual life. It is the beginning of one that is genuinely yours. The second step is to separate your pain from your identity. The fact that you have felt religious fear for years does not mean that fear is who you are. It does not mean you are condemned, spiritually broken, or permanently unworthy of understanding. It means your mind was shaped by causes that produce that emotion. And being the effect of causes is not a character flaw. It is the condition of every human being who has ever lived. Spinoza understood that the mind tends to identify with its strongest emotions. When sadness is deep enough, the mind believes it is a sad person. When guilt is constant enough, the mind believes it is a guilty person. When fear of God is persistent enough, the mind believes it is a sinful person deserving of punishment. But these are confusions of cause and identity. You are not your fear. You are a mind that has been shaped to feel fear, and that mind has the capacity to understand its own shaping. Separating pain from identity does not mean becoming emotionally numb or intellectually arrogant. It means recognizing that the voice inside you that says you are fundamentally bad, fundamentally deserving of punishment, fundamentally beyond the reach of the divine, is not the voice of truth. It is the voice of a belief that was delivered to you under circumstances that gave it enormous power. Understanding that distinction does not erase your spiritual seriousness. It gives it room to breathe. The third step is to choose better encounters. Spinoza believed that our minds and emotions are profoundly shaped by what we encounter. The ideas we read, the voices we listen to, the communities we belong to, the images we allow to define the divine for us. If every encounter with religious or spiritual content produces more guilt, more shame, more dread, and less understanding, then those encounters are not serving your freedom, they are feeding your bondage. This does not mean abandoning faith or tradition. It means bringing discernment to the question of which expressions of faith increase your power of understanding, and which ones reduce it to fear. A teaching that produces wonder and clarity and honest questioning is different from a teaching that produces panic and shame and the silencing of thought. You are allowed to notice that difference. You are, in fact, required to notice it if you want to live with genuine inner freedom. Seek encounters with thinkers, traditions, and ideas that take God and reality seriously without requiring you to surrender your capacity for reason. This is not about finding easy comfort. Spinoza never promised comfort, he promised understanding. And understanding of the divine, when pursued honestly, does not produce terror. It produces something closer to what Spinoza called intellectual love, a clarity so deep it begins to feel like devotion. The fourth step is one of the most difficult and most liberating moves in Spinoza's entire philosophy. Accept necessity without surrendering. What does this mean in the context of religious fear? It means acknowledging that you were shaped by causes you did not choose, without using that acknowledgement as a reason to remain passive inside the results of that shaping. You did not choose the family that introduced you to fear-based religion. You did not choose the moment in which guilt was tied to your sense of worth. You did not choose the emotional logic that made divine punishment feel like the most certain thing in your world. Those were causes that acted on you before you had the power to examine them. Accepting that necessity means releasing the secondary guilt of blaming yourself for having been shaped. You were shaped. It was necessary. It is done. But accepting necessity is not the same as surrendering to it. Spinoza was not teaching fatalism. He was teaching that the beginning of freedom is always an honest understanding of how things actually are. Once you understand the causes that shaped your fear, you have something you did not have before. The capacity to relate to those causes as causes rather than as eternal truths. And that capacity is the doorway. Not to a life without difficulty, not to a mind without struggle, but to a mind that is no longer simply the prisoner of what it inherited. That mind is no longer reacting in the dark. It is beginning finally to see. Here is what this journey has revealed. Fear of God and God are not the same thing. Guilt and wisdom are not the same thing. Terror and truth are not the same thing. Superstition is not faith. It is fear wearing the mask of faith. And a life built around inherited dread, no matter how sincerely it is lived, is not a life of genuine spiritual freedom. It is a life organized around a prison the mind never thought to examine because the prison was given a sacred name. Spinoza exposed this not to destroy belief but to transform it. He showed that fear has causes, that those causes are human and traceable, and that understanding them does not empty the universe of meaning. It fills it with something that blind obedience can never provide: genuine understanding. The God that remains after superstition is examined is not smaller. The God that remains is the one that can be approached not through dread but through the deepest activity of the mind itself. You began this video perhaps as someone who has quietly lived with the weight of divine judgment. Perhaps as someone who prays and still feels guilty. Perhaps as someone who no longer prays but still carries the ghost of a punishing God in every moment of self-doubt. You are not required to remain that person. Not because you can simply decide to feel different, but because understanding creates a genuine shift in who you are in relation to your own history. The identity that Spinoza points toward is not the identity of a rebel or a skeptic, or someone who has abandoned the question of God entirely. It is the identity of a rational seeker, a person who takes the question of reality, of the divine, of existence, seriously enough to examine it honestly. A person who refuses to confuse fear with depth, guilt with morality, or inherited dread with the voice of truth. That person is not less spiritual. That person is for the first time free enough to ask what spiritual actually means. At the beginning of this video, Spinoza asked the most terrifying question he could offer. Are you worshiping truth or obeying an image built by fear? You now have enough understanding to hear that question differently, not as an attack on your faith, but as an invitation to the only kind of relationship with the divine that philosophy can honestly recommend. A relationship built not on the threat of punishment, but on the genuine desire to understand what is real, what is necessary, and what it means to live with clarity inside a universe that operates entirely by cause. If this video has helped you begin to separate God from fear, the architecture of dread from the depth of genuine seeking, then subscribe to Spinoza Reveals. Not because this channel offers comfort, but because every video here is built on a single, serious promise that understanding is the only form of freedom worth pursuing, and there is far more to understand. The mind that has started to see will always want to go deeper.